Hello everybody, and welcome. Thank you everybody for joining us on today's webcast. My name is Dina Evans, and I am so very happy to be with everybody today. I'm the Marketing and Special Events Manager here at Looking Glass Cyber Solutions, and today's presentation is part 3 in our 4-part series on building successful threat intelligence programs. Today's session will focus on the key elements. And your Looking Glass presenter for today's session is Alan Thompson, who is our Chief Technology Officer. Before we get started, I just wanted to take a minute to run through a very few quick housekeeping notes from the BrightTalk webinar platform. Please note that on the drop-down menu on the right side of your screen, there's a chat feature, and I want everybody to feel free to submit any questions that you may have for today's speaker through that window. We do not have audio for our audience, so if there are any questions, they need to be submitted through that chat screen. At the end of today's session, we will try to address all the questions that come in. If we happen to run out of time, don't fret. We'll be sure to contact you directly following the presentation to make sure that all of your questions get answered. And also note that any questions that are submitted through the chat are only viewed by the presenters and not by fellow audience members. So if you prefer to have a question addressed privately, please indicate so in your comments, and we'll be sure to contact you directly if that's what's desired. And also make sure that you notice that we have an attachments and links section. Feel free to peruse those items. There's a few links to different features on our website. And then you can contact us directly if you would like any additional information sent to you. And we will be sending out a copy of Alan's presentation deck at the conclusion of the webcast. So if there's some additional info that you want from a slide that he goes through, that will be sent out to the full audience. So without any further delay, let's go ahead and let's pass this over to Alan, and he will kick off today's webcast. Alan?
Thank you, Dina. Welcome, everybody. We are in a 4-part series around threat intelligence programs and what are some of the key things that help make those programs successful. The prior 2 webinar sessions, we've covered initially what are the top-level requirements, what drives the need for threat intelligence programs. The second part, we introduced a framework in which to kind of bring context to how you structure your program, what are the key things that you're looking for. And in this program, we are going to dig into that framework a little more and give it a little bit more meat around the bones of, okay, we have this framework, but what does it mean for specific details of the program? So with that, I wanted to just recap the 7-part framework that we introduced previously. The first part is really before you start building a program, this might seem obvious, but oftentimes people don't really understand what are their objectives with the program. And so I must stress that if the clearer you understand your requirements of what you're trying to get out of a threat intelligence program, the better result it's going to be. And so capturing those requirements, making sure that they're clear, all of the stakeholders are involved. So for example, it's not just a technical exercise looking at analysts and security cyber experts, but also looking at what input you need from your finance departments, your executive C-level suite people, and what are they expecting out of this program. The second part of the framework we're going to dig into today is around who needs to be involved in executing the program. And that's different than necessarily how they're organized, which is the third part of the framework. So we talk about, okay, who do you need to hire, but also how do they interact and how do they work together to make the program successful. The fourth part of the framework we're going to talk about is around the processes in which you organize and define the program. So many times it depends on what your outcome is trying to achieve, whether you're trying to produce an executive report to a C-level suite, or you're trying to push course of actions through an automated system that gets pushed to a firewall. The processes in which you handle data, how you refine that data and ultimately push it to an outcome depends on what your goals are with the program, and we'll touch on some of the aspects of that. The fifth part of the program is really around what systems support that. So what systems need to be installed, deployed for the team to succeed, what systems need to be connected together so that you're getting the right data and the pipeline of data passing through your Intel program, what enrichment needs to take place, what analysis capabilities do you need to make work so that you can ultimately help the analysts. The sixth part is a critical part, which is around metrics and reporting, and we'll touch on what are some of the key objectives of what you should be looking for to measure your program on so that you can ultimately refine it and improve it, because a lot of threat intelligence program success is around taking baby steps and then refining and executing a sequence of improvements on top of those initial deployments so that you can improve either the data quality, improve the volume of data, improve the ability for analysts to pivot and understand threat intelligence, the ability to potentially improve the speed from collection all the way to either a report or an action. And so putting in the right framework in place to measure that is a key part of making the program successful. And then the final part is really what the program ultimately delivers and how it connects to the rest of the security ecosystem. So a threat intelligence program does not exist on its own. It oftentimes is part of a much broader security ecosystem either in your own environment or in a worldwide environment if you're connected to third parties, etc. And so how that system integrates with other components is important. Now in the prior presentation in the webinar, we introduced this framework that I just covered, but we also talked about third parties and understanding how threat intelligence can make your security posture more understood and less risk averse. And one of the key things is really understanding the picture of third parties in that environment. And we introduced in the prior webinar, and I would encourage you to look at the slides in the webinar recording around how you categorize your third parties and how you potentially can make sure that you are improving your security around integration with third parties. And we talked about this matrix where you can have more mature third parties who are more security mature, but also potentially more able to integrate their security processes with your own. But the key thing is that you still need to continue to be concerned about third-party security in your environment. And the examples that I'm showing on the screen really talk to the fact that, if you are a business of any maturity, typically you would depend on, either cloud providers, internet service providers, potentially you outsource your payroll, potentially you outsource other services, and what information that third party has may be important to your business operations. It may not just be about your own personnel, but also your customers, etc. And so making sure that that third party that you rely upon is secure or doing as much as they can to protect that information and applying good business practices around security is an important part of an assessment. So for the purposes of introducing details on the threat intel program, we're going to use a real-world example to talk through how you assess third parties and how you assess your supply chain, and use that as a way to describe a real-world threat intelligence program in more concrete terms. So the first thing is around requirements, and we've presented this concept in the last couple of webinars as well, that it's really critical that you understand what your outcomes are desired. Now this has very real impact on the program details. So for example, if you are a company that is publicly traded, you have executives who are fairly public personas. Your brand is associated with not just the company, but also potentially the individuals and how they communicate. And so depending on the threats that may be trying to detract from that great brand, you may want to collect information, for example, on brand information. Who is posting what about those executives? Are people trying to hack into those executives so they can steal their credentials and then embarrass them? You know, there's well documented or publicized examples where, you know, certain, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg's credentials were compromised at one point, primarily to embarrass, as far as I can see. And so that aspect of collecting data necessarily maybe focus you on, for example, okay, who would go after our executives? Where would they communicate, and what approaches would they take? What information do we need to collect to be able to understand what approaches those hacktivists would take to gather that information and potentially compromise their executives? Now that's one approach. A very different aspect of a threat intel program may be that you're looking at command and control botnet servers, or you would like a list of blacklist sites that have been known to be distributing malware. And so therefore you want to be able to collect that information as much as real time as possible, and then integrate that with a pipeline that then, you know, reduces false positives but also potentially pushes it to your firewalls. And so the requirements on, you know, the social media example that I gave around brand reputation and how you collect information, how you review that information, may be very different than if you're collecting a command and control botnet data set and how you refine that. So when you start setting up your program, think about these aspects very clearly. Another example, just to kind of give one more concrete example, is where you have identified through, you've set up a program where you're understanding who's phishing, you're understanding who's out there trying to compromise your integrity. They've stood up a domain that looks very similar to your primary domain. It may be a domain that has a few extra characters, maybe, you know, misspelled by one letter. And it's being used as a way to potentially phish and go after either your own executives or team or your customers who are using that website. Now, takedown of that site is really important because the sooner you both detect it through your phishing detection capability, but also your ability to then take that site down or request it being taken down by the provider who's standing that site up, is that, and automating that as much as possible is really important. And so that's not necessarily a trivial exercise, but if one of your objectives is to monitor for phishing sites that potentially are going to be used to compromise you, and then having an automated means where you have a well-defined process to be able to take those sites down is a critical part of making that program effective. You don't want to wait until you have identified the phishing site to then figure out, okay, well, what do I do now? Who do I contact to take down the site? Those things should all be seamless and well-defined well before you actually need to execute on it. So the second part of making this more real is around this real-world use case that I mentioned about third-party assessment. And this is based on a real-world program that we wanted to introduce to assess third parties or allow our clients assess third parties that they were relying upon. And the key objectives in terms of requirements were to provide a report or an assessment on that third party or supply chain vendor, and potentially then not just have an initial assessment, but also then to continue to assess them and continue to monitor for changes. And the changes that we wanted to make sure, or the initial assessment, wanted to cover things such as, what is the network footprint of that organization? So where are they on the internet? Do they have multiple sites? Do they have a single point of presence? Are they a global company? Are they a regional company? What are the well-known sites that represent that company? And part of the reason why you want to consider initially footprinting them is because oftentimes malicious activity that may occur, you may see sites popping up that look like they are actually part of that company, but they're not. Or there may be footprints or information about that vendor out there that is not necessarily configured correctly, or potentially is going to compromise that third party. And being aware of their footprint and the security posture of that footprint is a critical part of assessing whether they're highly secure or not. Another part of the assessment was really looking at, for example, the account credentials that are associated with that third party or supply chain vendor. So one of the key things that oftentimes actors do is they go after the easy human beings to potentially compromise their accounts, and then use those accounts to get inside the perimeter to then pivot and do further damage. So being aware of what credentials have been compromised of that third party gives you assessment of whether they have a robust policy and procedures for making sure they're protecting the credentials of their users, and also making sure how quickly they're able to respond or react to when a compromise may occur. And so being able to assess what is being posted on the global internet, in dark web as well as surface web for credentials, is a really important part of assessing that third party. So the second part of your program really needs to focus on who you need to hire, and the roles in which people perform is based on obviously their backgrounds and their skill sets. But this slide really talks to the fact that there are many different skill sets necessary for making an Intel program successful. It's not just making sure you hire somebody who knows how to do malware forensic analysis, for example. You need to understand, okay, if we plan to do malware analysis, so we hire the guy who knows how to do that, but what do we do with that analysis? Do we then extract IOCs that can then be pushed to a firewall? Do we integrate it as an executive report that ultimately goes up to the C-suite? Making sure that you have somebody who can articulate and put context around a very technical topic like an IOC or a malware analysis, and up-level it to a C-level and say, okay, this is our risk, this is our exposure to this risk, and therefore this is what we recommend in terms of changes to our security policy or to our firewalls, etc. And so be able to have the right skill sets and the right people involved in the Intel program is critical to actually making it an effective program. And think about this as part of your program definition. Now, with our real-world use case, we were developing an assessment of third parties and vendors. We had analysts, cyber analysts. We also had network analysts and social media analysts who understood where to gather information, how to refine that information to make sure that we were reducing false positives. But we also needed somebody to plan out the whole program. We also needed an architect who could understand how to connect a set of disparate systems that potentially are providing the data and connecting the data together. And then we needed somebody to manage that entire team. Now, ultimately, this is, if you're lucky, you might get one person who can do one or two of these roles, but typically you need to hire people with the right skill sets to be successful. And so when you build out your program, look for, okay, what are the critical functions that we need to perform, and let's go hire the right people. The third part of the program is around how people are organized. Now, if you are a large organization, you typically would have a 24/7 support staff who are looking at incoming intelligence information and potentially analyzing it in real time with help of machines, but also ultimately being able to do quick assessment to determine action. There may be a multiple tier level, which we would advise you do, because ultimately you can't necessarily hire a lot of experts for your program, so you may need to hire more junior staff who are able to be trained well on specific aspects of the task, and ultimately can add a lot of pre-filtering of events. So one of the key things with the team is how, what is the seniority, but also where they are physically and how they communicate with the rest of the team. Are they organized by shifts? Are they organized by a 9-to-5 work schedule, etc.? And these are all aspects that an Intel program needs to have well defined if it's to be successful in the organization. With our real-world use case, it was a fairly on-demand activity initially. We're moving to a more 24/7 operational model, so we're actually starting to look at hiring or getting the right tier level support so that this can be done more than just by experts. But the key point was that we had a need for software development, which would typically be done to connect all the systems together. That's typically like a 9-to-5 operating model. Running the reports is typically more on demand based on people who are looking for third-party assessment, and that would be, again, a 9-to-5 operation. So with the processes, the key things are around keeping it specific to what you need, to map the requirements, keeping it current, which means that just because you do it once and define a program and you get it all running, that means that you're not going to have to refine it and keep it up to date. The data that is continuously being published for intelligence is increasingly much more verbose. There's many different sources of information, making sure that you're getting the right information to match your requirements. APIs change, for example, so a provider of an intelligence feed may decide that they want to change their API, and you need to be considering, well, how do I make sure that my data feed pulling from that provider is maintained. So do you have the right developer to maintain that, or are you using a platform that is able to automate that transition from the old API to the new API? So keeping things current is a very active thing in terms of processing because it's a continuously evolving thing. With our framework, one of the key things that we've identified with the teams and the roles is making sure that you have a tiered support model. And this screenshot here shows you a high-level process of, on the left-hand side, we have all of our raw intelligence data, third-party information if you're assessing third parties, industry information if you're including assessment of segment information. You may have local information about your own organization, etc. You may also have topology information, ownership information, etc. You have a whole host of information that comes into this process, and the tier 1 level needs to consider, okay, how do I quickly review this data, decide its relevance to my organization, and then act on it. And that's where the tier 1 rapid alerting takes place, where you're able to quickly assess the data and decide, okay, it matches 10 out of 12 keywords that I'm looking for in, say, a social media post, or the data that's coming in identifies a C2 command, and I have log data that says that one of my internal hosts is actually communicating with that server. So that would be a flag to potentially go further investigation and potentially update firewalls. The second tier is around providing a lot more context and being able to do cross-event correlation. So the ability to understand not just a single event or intelligence event, but to understand a sequence of events that may be showing a campaign or an emerging campaign by an actor or actors to target your organization or others. So the ability to do much longer term analysis, the ability to connect the dots between seemingly disparate intelligence events into a more holistic understanding of the world that's attacking you is a key part of that multiple level. Now the response times for either tier 1 or tier 2 varies depending on your maturity of both the machines that you're analyzing the data, but also the human beings. So typically the tier 1 would be looking to 1 to 3 minute response time from initial collection to acting on that data. And then the tier 2 would typically be much slower, but not that much slower, 10 to 30 minutes. Now, for anybody who's familiar with some of the public intelligence feeds out there, some public feeds are published maybe every 24 hours. Some feeds are real time, in which case you're getting data, minute by minute. Now, obviously, if you're collecting data on a 24-hour window where you're pulling down a large list of data and determining what to do about that data every 24 hours, that dictates how you respond to that data versus if you're receiving data every 1 to 3 minutes and trying to get real-time responsiveness. So it depends on, again, back to the requirements. If your requirements are real-time awareness of social media or attackers who are posting data on a site in real time and you want to respond to that in real time, you need to go to where am I getting this data? How am I making sure the data is collected in real time and refined so that I can then make immediate decisions? How am I escalating that event data once I've identified that it's relevant to my organization to my tier 2 analyst support level? And how do they then respond back to me once they've done further analysis? All of these aspects of the program are critical to work on to make it successful. A second example for the part 4 around processes around phishing, and this is just another example to help solidify the point that it depends on what your program is trying to achieve, defines what the process is for your program. So this example is how phishing detection takes place, the people who are involved in reviewing the data, how they interact as the data and the machines process the phishing. So as a phish site or a potential phish site is identified, what is the process to either determine that it actually is a legitimate phish site that needs to be taken down, or, what machines are involved, what human beings are involved, and documenting that and making sure that this is actually ultimately defined in the product that you're using is important. So the the process for a real-world use case of assessment, really, we mentioned this already, was to gather information about the third party or the supply chain vendor that we know. So for example, what do we know about their domains or their systems that they use? And this information would typically be gathered in a questionnaire or a Q&A with the organization. If it's public information, then that can help without requiring the Q&A. What information does that third party want to make sure is not compromised? So what is their, for example, their email account use? What is the form factor they use, etc. And what applications do you use? So gather that information. The second phase is the assessment, and I'll talk later about some of the more details on this, but assess all of these aspects of intelligence associated with that third party. And then finally produce a report that ultimately drives action either in the third party themselves or in your own organization on how you deal with that third party. The systems that you need to support the Intel program, I think I've kind of explained a lot of different examples already where there's many different products and capabilities you need for a successful Intel program. It's not just a threat intel platform. You potentially need to have automated response, so the ability to automate takedown, the ability to verify and understand whether a phishing site is actually a phishing site, the ability to gather social media capabilities, the ability to manage your team and how they manage the intelligence process. So typically it's not just gathering the information, but also then the enrichment by analysts to cue that in their daily lives of analysis. Back to that picture where we had tier 1 and tier 2, the data may be escalated. Are you using a help desk software to manage that process? That's a piece of software that you need to introduce into your environment to make the program successful. And then finally, if you're managing a team that is 24/7 global coverage, you potentially have lower scale, lower paid employees who need to be managed in terms of their time and what they're focused on. And so therefore, it's not just making sure that they're able to use the tip, but also our managers able to see what they're doing in terms of time management of the individuals working on the Intel program. So all of these systems need to exist to make your program successful. In our specific case, with the real-time cyber assessment, we needed vulnerability scanner software. We needed the ability to do both open source and commercial network footprinting, so the ability to gather information about network ownership, for example, who is, as an example, the ability to understand how that is connected to the rest of the global internet, so be able to download or gather, for example, BGP routing, autonomous system information, etc. The ability to do dark and surface web crawling, so go gather information about who's been posting in particular sites with credentials, for example. Have they been posting malware that's specifically targeted at a particular third party, etc., etc. So the ability to crawl that information and gather that information is critical. The database and spreadsheet capability, sadly, is still a very common tool that's used by the teams to gather this information, to be able to reduce duplicate information. So if you're gathering information from multiple sites, how can you easily reduce that from duplicate to single data? And then finally, the ability to manage all of this intelligence information in a platform is really important. So all of these systems were deployed as part of our real-world use case. And here's an example of the process and the systems in effect. So you can see on the top we have like a timeline almost. It's not actually a timeline. It's a process where we're able to gather and step through the data collection and analysis process, and you will see those blue titled windows where we identified infection records associated with the third party, compromises associated with the third parties, what network intelligence do we have associated with the third party, what open source information has to say, is there any postings about that, and then finally vulnerability scanning information. So after we've done a network footprint of that third party, what information have we assessed by doing the vulnerability scan of their systems to determine what exploits potentially could be taken advantage of on that third party. So this dashboard shows you how we connected all these different systems together to be able to automate an entire process to come up with a complete report and an assessment of that third party. The metrics and reporting, as I said at the beginning of the webinar, are really critical. I can't understate really, if you want good quality in your program, you really need to measure and put in place a discipline of where you measure not just the data you're collecting, but also the effectiveness of the data, how that data flows through your processes, how are human beings interact with that. Are they spending 8 hours a day analyzing events, or are they spending 8 hours a day dealing with API incompatibility issues? Those are the types of things where if you measure and you measure your end-to-end workflow, you'll start to get a picture of where to make it more effective. And it's not just about looking at reporting on alerting, for example. So if I get say 10,000 alerts from a data feed, how many of those turn into false positives, how many of them are actionable, and reporting that. It's also time from collection to action, so not just the number, but also how quick is the action taken. So all of these aspects of measuring the Intel program are critical to looking at how you can improve it going forward. And keep it specific. one of the key things that a lot of reports can do is they can show you a lot of data, but ultimately does that mean that it's actionable, or does that mean that it's relevant to the audience that you're going to be giving this report to? So if you're giving a C-level suite executive a report on the effectiveness of your Intel program, that's going to be different than, say, if you're giving it to an analyst or a programmer who's looking to refine or get better data out of the raw noise. So how much of the data you're able to pull out, what aspects of the data is being useful to action versus a C-level executive who's more interested in risk assessment to the organization. So look at what you're specifically trying to do and then make it relevant. With our our real-time threat support, we provided a report that was broken down into executive level as well as detailed IOC and detailed information about each aspect. For the purposes of this webinar, the key point here is that we provided a comprehensive overview of, okay, after we've done all of this assessment, we provide an assessment of, a dashboard, if you will, across all of the different areas, the health of that third party in assessment. As we dig into the individual sections, we provided much more assessment of things like total records analyzed, recent breaches, etc., much more detail in each area of the report, so that if somebody who's more interested in the nitty-gritty details of an assessment, they can see that, but the executive summary is what we led with. Sorry. Another example is the vulnerability report. So here we are able to identify, after we've assessed, we've footprinted the organization, and then we've assessed their external vulnerabilities, and we see we can identify which CVEs that those are associated with. We can also identify the associated risk if they don't actually resolve those vulnerabilities, and that provides an overall assessment of that third party, but it also gives very tangible, very actionable areas to go target on where to fix particular issues on that third party. So if you're working closely with a third party and you have a very good relationship with that third party, this report could be shared with them, and you could potentially work together to both fix it but also then reassess, so that you can focus on the important ones, first of all, so prioritization of what vulnerabilities are a must fix, and then verification. And these are just some more examples of additional details. The final part of the Intel program that's really critical is around connecting to the rest of the world. So a lot of organizations who are looking to stand up an Intel program, or may already have one, but they feel like it's not been as effective. One of the key things is making sure that you're connected to other organizations that are focused on intelligence sharing, best practices, security, etc. Making sure you're part of those organizations and receiving information is a critical part of making the overall program successful. But also knowing who to call when a particular scenario occurs. So in the example I gave earlier about a phishing domain stood up. Who do you know on the service provider to contact? What's the process that service provider requires to be able to take that site down? Knowing all of that information a priori before it occurs is really important. And so having that well documented in your program, potentially documenting the contacts, the phone numbers, the emails, all part of your Intel program platform, for example, so that a junior analyst doesn't have to go find a senior analyst to get knowledge of this information. This is all readily available when it occurs, so that if you want to achieve that 1 to 3 minute response time, they're not looking for the information. They're not looking to respond. They're not looking to figure it out. They just mechanically, okay, I get an event, I see a phishing domain, the system has automatically determined it, I confirm that it's a phishing domain, who do I need to contact? And you're able to pull all of that up. It identifies the provider, it identifies the information to contact, and it's immediate, and it's click button response time. And that's the way you achieve those response times that I showed earlier. With our real-world use case, we provided report information, and ultimately drove vulnerability management team. So as I said, the systems needing to be patched. The policy and password changes, sometimes we've passed it to IT departments running third-party security around their passwords, and we're able to show them, that they needed to improve some of that. The supply chain third-party team and organizations themselves, so deciding who should be chosen as a supply chain or a third party, these reports also help that. And then finally, the IOC, pulling IOCs out of the third-party assessment report and then pushing that information to your security and network operations team to update security infrastructure like a firewall. That's also possible because we provided IOCs in a standardized, structured language that was easily machine-readable. And so we were able to drive from a single report, a whole load of improvement across both our own organization that is potentially running this assessment for that third party, but also the third party themselves. So to sum up, we've previously recommended, let's make sure that your program understands the requirements. Define a framework. We recommend a 7-part framework and apply that to your specific needs. Focus on self and third-party programs, particularly third-party maturity, and focus on categorizing your third-party. And with this webinar, one of the key things I wanted to point out is you really need to automate where you can. With the amount of information that is available out there for intelligence, you need to look at either systems that you bring in yourself or look at vendors who can provide this automation for you. But you really need to look at, be able to automate from intelligence to action as much as possible, while making sure that you're making your analysts more focused on the things that are not easily automatable. So potentially the ability of connecting dots across different disparate events, the ability to analyze images where a image matching algorithm does not necessarily identify everything in the image. Those are types of things where human beings excel, and so be able to focus your machine automation on making those analysts and experts more effective is important. Then the final tip is around making sure your metrics and reporting drive the improvements continuously. So build that into your program right from day one. Look at where you need to measure, not just define the processes and the systems you need, but also look to where the metrics are going to be gathered and how they're going to be reported. Now, on our final part, our final webinar in a few weeks, we're going to give you some demos of a real-world, third-party assessment program that I refer to here. We're going to show you how a threat intel program can execute on all of these guidelines that I've described here. And with that, I will pass it back to Dina for any questions or from the audience. Thank you, Dina.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, there's a few that have started to trickle in. Let's go through a couple of these. Here's the first one. It says, what's the most important thing to measure for a threat intelligence program?
So there's a lot of things you can measure. One of the things that I think a lot of organizations that I've interacted with, they often are looking for, okay, what is the value of this intelligence? And I think if there was one thing to choose, it's really look at what's the effectiveness of this intelligence in my organization and how to measure that. It really depends on your specific intel program. As I mentioned right at the beginning, if you're looking to gather a blacklist of C2 websites that are then pushed to firewalls and make sure that the false positive rate is low, then that would be an example where you want to measure the quality of the data and the effectiveness of it, and what's your false positive rate. So really, there's many things that you want to measure, but I think starting to focus on the data and the data quality and how effective it is for your environment is a really important thing to measure.
Good point. Here's another one. It says, should threat intelligence programs consider active measures when responding to threats?
Yeah, so that's a very loaded question. Active measures is something that I think it depends on the legality in your regional issues. But passive collection of intelligence information and potentially blocking that, it's a very passive. You're not necessarily letting somebody who may be targeting you know that you know about them. You may be just blocking it. There are things that, for example, should be active. For example, the example I talked about with phishing and takedown, I would consider that an active response where you're able to identify a phishing domain, you're able to then go and execute a takedown on that domain, and that is effectively making that attack or that vector of attack neutralized. And so it's a very active engagement where you're going out and you're explicitly taking that site down so that that particular site cannot be used to attack you or attack your organization or customers using that site. So I would encourage people to look at intelligence program not just in terms of passive collection and response, but also very actively going out there legally using active measures to respond to those threats in real time.
That's very good information, Alan. And right now we're running over time. We have 45 minutes allotted, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up on that with a couple other questions, but we will respond to these directly, Alan. So thank you so much for your presentation today, Alan, and thank you to everybody that's attended today's live webcast from Looking Glass. There'll be a copy of today's recording that will be on our resources page on our Looking Glass website, and you can see that through the attachments and links section. You can go directly to our website. We'll also be sending out a copy of that link and the follow-up email from our team as well. And there's right here listed on Alan's screen is how to contact Looking Glass. So if you need to contact us directly, there's some different ways to get in touch with us. And if you make sure to register as well, we have part 4 that will be coming up here in August. That will take place on August 24th. Be sure to register for that. That'll be part 4 of our 4-part series that Alan's been presenting. Alan, did you have anything else that you wanted to add at this time?
No, I appreciate everybody's time, and thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Alan, and thank you again to everybody today. And we hope to see you on August 24th. With that, we'll conclude our session. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.